In the summer of 2015, on a sun-bleached promenade in Catalonia, a Spanish photographer was conducting a routine commercial assignment. His remit was modest: produce a set of stock photographs depicting the abstract concept of jealousy. He hired 3 models. He posed them on a railing overlooking the Mediterranean. He shot, by his own subsequent estimate, somewhere in the region of 40 exposures. He uploaded them to a stock photography agency, was paid a small flat fee, and turned his attention to the next assignment. One of those 40 exposures would, within 2 years, become arguably the most deployed image in the history of digital rhetorical illustration. It would be used to argue about software languages, geopolitics, theological controversy, exercise regimens, the relative merits of cats and dogs, and the structural integrity of the European Union. It would be deployed by news organizations, presidential candidates, multinational corporations, and, in one celebrated case, the official social media account of the United Nations. And it would do all of this without changing a single pixel. Let us begin with the image. You know, the image. 3 young people are arrayed along a public walkway. On the left stands a young woman in a red blouse and pale blue trousers, her head turned over her shoulder, her hand raised in an expression of indignant disbelief. In the center stands a young man in a checked shirt and beige slacks, his attention diverted away from his companion and toward a third figure. On the right walks the third figure, a young woman in a red top and gray skirt, oblivious, or perhaps not quite, oblivious to the gaze that is fixed upon her. The composition is, by the standards of competent commercial photography, extremely effective. The 3 figures form what art historians would call a vector triangle. The lines of gaze and posture create a closed triangular field of tension. The viewer's eye is drawn along the diagonal of the boyfriend's stare, deflected by the girlfriend's outraged glare, and pulled back by the cool indifference of the passing woman. It is, in short, a small theatrical scene rendered in a single frame. The photographer was a man named Antonio Guillem. He had been working in stock photography for over 20 years and was, in his own estimate, accustomed to producing perhaps 8,000 images per annum. None of them, to his recollection, had previously achieved any notable degree of cultural diffusion. The 3 models in the shot had been hired through a local agency for approximately 2 days of work and would, in the months that followed, find themselves in the curious position of being among the most viewed human faces on the planet. For nearly 2 years, the image existed in the dim half-life of the stock photography archive. It was, occasionally, licensed by a regional newspaper to illustrate an article about relationships. It was reposted, without notable comment, to a handful of obscure online galleries. And then, in January of 2017, something rather unexpected happened. On a Turkish-language music forum, a user posted the photograph with the 3 figures labeled. The young woman in red was labeled Faye's Eggs. The boyfriend was labeled The Listener. The passing woman was labeled Faye's Rock. It was, by all available evidence, a joke about a small subgenre of progressive rock music, the precise dimensions of which need not detain us. What matters is the structural innovation it introduced. The structural innovation, dear viewer, was simple but profound. It allowed any user, anywhere, to participate in the joke by performing a single act of labeling. One assigned the figure of the girlfriend to whatever one had previously been loyal to. One assigned the figure of the boyfriend to oneself. One assigned the passing woman to whatever one had been recently tempted to abandon the previous loyalty for. The image, in this manner, became a fill-in-the-blanks rhetorical device of universal applicability. Why did this format succeed where so many others failed? To answer that, we must examine, with some precision, what the format permits. First, the image provides 3 distinct, labeled positions, which is rather more than most analogical templates of the period could offer. Most prior templates, the This Is Fine Dog, for example, or the various rage comic faces, offered only a single position, which the user could caption with a single thought. The distracted boyfriend, by contrast, offered an entire triangular relationship. It offered, in effect, a sentence with a subject, an object, and a betrayal. Second, the image possessed what semioticians would call high facial legibility. The expressions of all 3 figures are, despite the lack of any spoken context, immediately interpretable. The girlfriend is unmistakably wronged. The boyfriend is unmistakably caught. The passing woman is unmistakably the catalyst. No language is required to read the basic emotional content of the scene. Third, and most importantly, the analogical structure permitted by the image happens to map almost perfectly onto the most common rhetorical move in human discourse, which is the accusation that someone has abandoned a worthy old loyalty in favor of an unworthy new one. This is, in fact, the structural skeleton of approximately 1 in every 3 opinion articles published since 1850. By the summer of 2017, the image had escaped its original Turkish progressive rock context entirely. It had been deployed, in rapid succession, to comment upon the choices of software developers, the geopolitical alignment of small European nations, the relative loyalties of sports fans. and the ongoing aesthetic debate between two major mobile telephone operating systems. The peak of the format's institutional adoption occurred, by my reckoning, in late August of 2017, when a Swedish governmental social media account deployed the image to illustrate official policy commentary on traffic safety. The Swedish government, dear viewer, had become a meme. This, one feels, represents a watershed of some kind. By the year's end, the image had been adapted into a fine art parody by a major British newspaper. Reproduced as a Baroque oil painting in classical style by an enterprising digital artist, and, in one particularly notable example, sculpted by an Italian art collective as a life-size bronze tableau and installed temporarily in a public square in Florence. One could, and many tourists did, be photographed standing in the position of the betrayed girlfriend, the wandering boyfriend, or the passing woman, depending on temperament. One of the more interesting, and, I would venture, slightly poignant, side effects of the meme was its impact upon the three young people whose faces had been so widely deployed. None of them had received any meaningful additional compensation beyond their original modeling fees. None of them had given any explicit consent to the use of their faces in political or commercial contexts. And yet, by 2018, the boyfriend in the checked shirt was being recognized in airports. The young woman who had played the girlfriend gave a small number of interviews to Spanish-language media in which she expressed something between bemused tolerance and mild exasperation. She noted, with some justice, that her one consistent professional achievement had been, in the eyes of approximately 400 million internet users, being publicly cheated upon. The passing woman, by contrast, has retained a kind of mysterious silence on the matter, which has only enhanced her semiotic potency in the meme itself. Like all dominant mimetic forms, the distracted boyfriend eventually saturated. By 2019, the format had been deployed so extensively that its deployment had itself become a target of parody. One began to encounter meta versions, tableaux, in which the girlfriend was labeled fresh memes, and the passing woman was labeled the distracted boyfriend meme. One encountered double-layered versions in which the boyfriend was, in turn, distracted by a fourth figure, and so on, recursively, until the image collapsed under the weight of its own analogical capacity. And yet, and this is the curious property of certain rare memes, the format has not, properly speaking, died. It has retired, perhaps, into a kind of background ubiquity. It is no longer the dominant analogical form, but it is still summoned, in the right contexts, with the same instant recognizability that it possessed at its peak. It has become, in the deepest sense of the word, classical. So consider, in closing, the absurdity of the situation. A Spanish photographer, on a routine afternoon's work, hires 3 models to illustrate the concept of jealousy. He shoots 40 exposures, gets paid a modest fee, and goes home. One of the exposures becomes, against every reasonable expectation, the dominant visual analogical device of an entire era of human discourse. It is deployed by governments, by corporations, by lovers, by professors, by political dissidents. It mediates arguments in over 40 languages. And it does all of this because the central figure in the checked shirt was, for a fraction of a second, looking exactly the wrong way. One look. 2 faces of betrayal. And the entire internet, for very nearly a decade, standing at the railing with him,